The parchment hit the table like a gunshot. Margaret Hart did not flinch. She had learned a long time ago that flinching was the first thing a woman could not afford in Caldwell County, Kansas, in the year 1882. Not when the land beneath her boots was worth more than her life to the wrong kind of men. Not when her husband had been in the ground for 14 months and the vultures had been circling since before the dirt settled. She stood at the far end of the table in the Caldwell County land office, her dark hair pinned back severely, her jaw set like iron, her green eyes fixed on the man who had just slapped the deed down with the theatrical confidence of someone who had rehearsed this moment many times in a mirror. His name was Dorian Holt, and he wore a suit that cost more than most homesteaders made in 6 months. He had ridden in 3 days ago, and in those 3 days he had done nothing but talk to bankers, whisper in the ears of county commissioners, and smile at Margaret with the particular smile of a man who believed he had already won. Beside Holt stood a woman named Cecilia Vane. She was beautiful in the way that expensive things sometimes are, carefully constructed, deliberately presented, every detail calibrated for effect. She wore a traveling dress of deep burgundy, her blonde hair swept up beneath a hat with an ostrich feather that trembled slightly in the draft from the open door. She was the widow's rival. She had arrived claiming that she was the rightful heir to the Blackwood Ranch through her deceased husband, Aldous Vane, who she claimed had purchased it from Margaret's late husband, Thomas Hart, 18 months prior. The deed said so, right there in black ink. Margaret looked at it. She had looked at it for 2 minutes without speaking, which had made Dorian Holt visibly uncomfortable, which she had enjoyed slightly despite everything. Then the door to the land office opened, and Warren Sullivan walked in. He was not a small man. He was the kind of man that a room rearranged itself around without anyone deciding to rearrange it. 6 feet 2 inches of sun-darkened skin and quiet, controlled strength. He wore a worn canvas duster, a flat-brimmed hat that had seen too many seasons, and the kind of expression that had nothing to prove. He worked as a land surveyor and legal consultant for the county, an unusual role for a man who looked like he had spent most of his life on horseback, which he had. But Warren Sullivan had also spent years learning land law with the same focused intensity he had applied to everything else that mattered, and in Caldwell County, land law mattered more than almost anything. He crossed the room, picked up the deed without a word and read it. His expression did not change. Then he tore it in half. Dorian Holt came to his feet so fast his chair clattered backward. Cecilia Vane made a sound like a small, strangled bird. The county clerk, a man named Elias Morrow, pressed himself against the wall and appeared to consider whether the door was within sprinting distance. Warren Sullivan set the 2 halves of the deed on the table with the careful precision of a man who had decided exactly how much force to use, and then he looked at Dorian Holt and said, "That document was filed with a notarial seal from the Kansas State Office dated March 14, 1881. The Kansas State notarial seal did not change to its current stamp design until April 2, 1881. The seal on that deed uses the new design, which means whoever made it had access to a stamp that did not exist on the date the deed claims to have been executed." Silence stretched across the room like a held breath. Warren Sullivan's eyes moved to Cecilia Vane. "Whoever advised you used a forged instrument, ma'am. That is a federal offense." Then his eyes moved to Margaret Hart, and something passed between them, not warmth exactly, not yet, because they were strangers still in the ways that mattered, but something that recognized the stakes she had been carrying and acknowledged them. Margaret Hart let out the breath she had been holding for 3 days. But the story did not end there, because Dorian Holt was not finished, and the secrets buried beneath the Blackwood Ranch were far darker and far more dangerous than a forged deed. 3 days before Warren Sullivan walked into that land office, Margaret Hart had been standing in the north pasture of Blackwood Ranch at 4:30 in the morning, watching the light bleed out of the eastern horizon, and trying to calculate how many more weeks she could sustain operations without an additional line of credit from the Caldwell Savings Bank. The ranch had been called Blackwood since before Thomas Hart had purchased it from its original homesteader, a man named George Blackwood, who had died without heirs in 1876. Thomas had bought it with every dollar he had, and Margaret had worked it with every ounce of energy she possessed. She had managed the cattle accounts herself, had negotiated grazing rights with neighboring ranchers, had learned surveying instruments well enough to dispute a boundary claim 2 years earlier and win. She was 31 years old and had been running this ranch effectively since about 6 months after the wedding, when it became apparent that Thomas was a man of vision and enthusiasm but impractical financial habits. She did not resent Thomas for that. She had loved him in the way that you love someone who is genuinely good even when they are not particularly competent. He had been warm and funny and kind, and he had trusted her completely with the business of their life together. She had trusted him with the warmth and the laughter and the sense that there was more to life than ledgers and property lines. When he died, a fever, nothing dramatic, just a fever that came in October and did not leave, she had sat with the grief, and then she had gotten up because the cattle still needed feeding and the mortgage still needed paying and the world had no patience for her loss. 14 months. She had managed 14 months alone. And now this. She had first heard about Cecilia Vane through a woman named Pearl Dawes, who ran the millinery shop in town and had the sharpest ears in the county. Pearl had come out to the ranch on a Tuesday with a bolt of practical cotton and a piece of information that Margaret had felt land in her chest like a stone dropped in still water. A woman claiming inheritance to the Blackwood property. A deed. A lawyer from Wichita named Dorian Holt, who apparently had connections to Judge Armand Fell, who was known to be flexible in his interpretations of property law when the right amount of money was applied. Margaret had gone straight to her study and pulled out every document she had ever filed related to the ranch. She had spread them across the table and gone through them with the same systematic precision she applied to surveying work. She had her original deed. She had the transfer records from when Thomas had purchased from the Blackwood estate. She had the mortgage papers from the Caldwell Savings Bank. She had 5 years of tax receipts in meticulous order, because Margaret Hart kept everything in meticulous order. What she did not have was someone with enough legal standing and enough personal credibility to stand in front of a judge and explain what she knew to be true, that this claim was fraudulent. Pearl Dawes had given her the name Warren Sullivan. "He is not a lawyer exactly," Pearl had said, arranging cotton bolts with the unhurried confidence of someone who had given good advice before. "He is more of a man who knows the law better than most lawyers do. He surveyed the Morrison property dispute last spring and settled it in 3 days when everyone thought it would take 6 months. He is honest. More importantly, he is the kind of honest that does not bend when important people push on it." Margaret had sent a message to Warren Sullivan's office in Caldwell that same evening. She had not expected him to come out to the ranch the following morning, but that is what he did. She had been working the corrals when he arrived, not watching from the house, not waiting with tea prepared, but actually working, because the fence on the east side of the corral had developed a problematic lean, and she had been addressing it herself since 6 that morning with a post driver and a determination that brooked no delay. Her work coat was dusty, her hands were gloved, and she had a measuring line looped over one shoulder when she heard a horse come into the yard and turned to look. Warren Sullivan sat on a gray horse with an ease that spoke of a man who had spent more time mounted than not. He looked at her standing in the corral with the post driver in one hand and the measuring line on her shoulder, and something in his face registered a brief recalibration, as though he had arrived with one expectation and was adjusting it. He dismounted without hurry and tied his horse at the post and walked to the corral fence and said, "Mrs. Hart, Warren Sullivan." "I know who you are," she said. "Give me a moment." She drove the last post, checked the line, found it satisfactory, and climbed over the fence. She pulled off one glove and offered her hand, which he shook with a firmness that did not perform itself. Pearl Dawes told me about your situation, he said. Then you know it is pressing. I know the time frame is short. Judge Fell has a docket opening in 4 days, and Holt has apparently applied for an emergency property hearing. The forged deed is the instrument they intend to use. Margaret looked at him steadily. You know it is forged. I suspect it. I will not know until I see it. Then I need to get you in a room with it. That is the plan, he agreed. They went inside, and she made coffee because it was cold and practical, and spread her own documents on the table while he reviewed them. He was methodical about it, moving through the papers with a careful attention that she recognized in herself. He asked precise questions. He did not ask obvious questions or repeat questions she had already answered. He made notes in a small leather-bound book with a pencil that he occasionally sharpened with a small folding knife. At one point, he asked about the date of the original Blackwood purchase transfer, and Margaret pulled out her surveying records without being asked, and showed him the property line documentation she had made the year after they purchased the land, complete with measurements and reference markers, all in her own hand. He looked at it for a long moment. You did this yourself. I did. This is professional quality work. I was taught by a government surveyor who worked this county in 1874 and 1875. I watched everything he did and asked him questions until he started charging me for the lessons, and then I read every text on surveying I could obtain. She said it matter-of-factly, because that was what it was. The property lines on this ranch are documented more precisely than any neighboring property in the county. I made sure of that because Thomas had a habit of not making sure of things. Warren Sullivan put the surveying records down and looked at her with an expression she could not entirely read. Not quite admiration, not yet, but something attentive and recalibrating again. Those records will be useful, he said. They establish your continuous possession and management of the property in a way that no fraudulent deed can easily argue against. That is what I thought, she said. And then, because something in the way he was looking at the records had struck her as significant, what else are you thinking? He looked up. I am thinking that whoever forged that deed was thorough enough to get most things right, which means they had help from someone with real legal knowledge. Dorian Holt is not working alone on the legal side. Judge Fell, possibly, but judges are careful about direct involvement, more likely someone with access to the notarial stamp records. Margaret picked up her coffee cup. The county clerk's office. Warren was quiet for a moment. Then, what makes you say that? Elias Morrow was appointed to the county clerk position 2 years ago by Commissioner Brent Halliday. Halliday has been trying to acquire grazing rights along the eastern edge of this property since Thomas was alive. He offered twice, and both times Thomas declined. After Thomas died, Halliday offered again. I declined. She set down the cup. Halliday has money and connections and no particular relationship with legal scruples. If someone needed access to official stamps or seal records, Halliday could arrange it through Morrow. Warren Sullivan looked at her with an expression that had moved decisively past recalibration and arrived somewhere that she could only describe as respect. Real respect, not the performed kind. The kind that costs something because it requires you to adjust what you thought you knew. That is a significant accusation, he said. I am not making it publicly yet, Margaret replied. I am telling you because you need to know what you are walking into. This is not just a fraudulent deed filed by an opportunistic widow and her lawyer. This is a coordinated effort involving at least 3 parties with local power and potentially a compromised judge. If we go into that land office with nothing but the notarial seal argument, and if Morrow has been coached on what to say, or if Fell rules from the bench before we can bring the full evidence forward, we lose. Warren Sullivan leaned back in his chair and looked at her for a long moment in the warm morning light that came through the study window. Mrs. Hart, he said, and his voice had changed subtly in a way she noticed. I have handled a considerable number of property disputes in this county and in 3 others. I have sat across from a great many people who believed they understood the legal situation they were facing. He paused. You understand yours better than most men with formal legal training. Margaret held his gaze. I understand that my home is at stake. That tends to focus the mind. It does, he said. For most people, not everyone thinks strategically under that kind of pressure. She did not respond to that directly because she was not in the habit of accepting compliments without deciding whether they were earned. She pulled out another document instead, a letter she had written 3 days prior, before she knew Holt had a deed, when she had only heard rumors of the claim. It was a letter to the Kansas Secretary of State's office requesting the precise dates of changes to notarial seal designs over the past 2 years. She slid it across the table. I sent this before I contacted you. The reply came yesterday. He picked it up and read it, and she watched his face. The reply confirmed that the current Kansas state notarial seal design had been put into use on April 2nd, 1881. Any document bearing that design and dated before that date was invalid on its face. Warren Sullivan put the letter down slowly. You were already building the case, he said. I did not know exactly what the forgery would look like, she replied. But I knew it would have a flaw, because perfect forgeries require perfect information, and forgers rarely have perfect information. So I went looking for the categories of information they were most likely to be wrong about. He was quiet for a moment, and in that quiet Margaret could hear the ranch sounds outside, the cattle moving in the far pasture, the wind picking up a little from the northwest, and she wondered what he was thinking with an intensity that she found slightly annoying, because she was not accustomed to caring what men thought in that particular way. The letter from the Secretary of State, he finally said, combined with visual examination of the seal on their deed will be definitive. That is enough to invalidate the document in any honest proceeding. And if the proceeding is not honest, then we make it public before it begins, he said, in a way that makes dishonesty inconveniently visible. That was the moment, Margaret thought later, when she began to trust Warren Sullivan, not because he was strong, though he clearly was. Not because he was competent, though that was evident, but because his instinct when facing a potentially corrupt system was not to work around it secretly or to fight it through brute force. It was to use transparency as a weapon. It was the instinct of someone who understood that public accountability was more powerful than private maneuvering. She recognized that instinct because it was her own. The 2 days between that morning and the confrontation at the land office were among the most intense of Margaret Hart's life, which was saying something given the competition. She and Warren worked from the ranch and from his office in town in alternating sessions, building a documentation package that addressed not just the notarial seal, but every other potential legal vulnerability in the fraudulent claim. It was during these 2 days that Margaret began to know Warren Sullivan as a person rather than a function. He was from Colorado originally, she learned. He had come to Kansas 6 years ago after a period that he described only as a difficult one, which she noted and did not press. He had learned land law from a mentor in Denver named Obadiah Rusk, who had been a genuine legal scholar despite never having practiced formally. Warren had surveyed and disputed and resolved property cases across the territory for 5 years before settling in Caldwell. He did not talk about himself easily. He talked about work easily, about the law, about the land, about the principles that governed both in ways that she found deeply interesting because they were the same things she thought about. But personal information came out in small pieces, almost accidentally, as if he was not entirely accustomed to the process of being known. She noticed, on the first afternoon, that he had a habit when he was concentrating very hard of pressing the pad of his thumb against the side of his index finger in a slow, repetitive motion. She noticed that he drank his coffee black without sugar, but always thanked her specifically when she poured it, as though the specificity of gratitude was important to him. She noticed that he had a slight, barely perceptible pause before he said anything he considered genuinely significant, as though he was checking the weight of the words before he committed them. She noticed these things the way she noticed survey data precisely, and because they might matter later. On the evening of the second day, they were working in her study by lamplight, going over the property tax receipts for the fourth time to ensure the sequence was airtight, and Margaret made a comment about a discrepancy in the 1879 records that she had been unable to explain for 2 years, a difference of 4 acres in the total taxable acreage between 2 different county assessments. Warren looked up from his papers. "Show me." She showed him. He spread out her surveying records alongside the assessments and spent 15 minutes with a pencil and her measuring instruments doing calculations. The 1879 assessment used the wrong baseline for the eastern boundary, he said finally. Whoever did the county assessment measured from the Sargent Creek bed, but the Sargent Creek bed shifted slightly after the spring floods in 1877. Your original deed and your survey used the original 1876 markers, which are still legally binding. The 1879 assessor made an error. You were actually paying taxes on slightly less land than you own. Margaret stared at the calculations. I knew there was an error. I could not find it. It is subtle. Most people would not catch it. I should have caught it. The slight edge in her voice was directed entirely at herself. You were running a ranch alone, he said, and the simplicity of the observation, not pitying, not excusing, just acknowledging, was unexpectedly disarming. She looked at him across the lamplight and felt something shift in the distance between them, not dramatically, not obviously, but perceptibly. You have been doing this alone for 14 months, he said. It was not quite a question. Yes, that is a significant operation for one person. I have a good crew. 2 hired hands, both reliable, and Pearl Dawes' brother Joseph, who helps with the cattle drives twice a year. Still, she met his eyes. I am capable of it. I know that, he said, and there was nothing in his tone that suggested he had ever doubted it, which she found was more than she expected from almost any man she had spoken to in the past 14 months. Most men either patronized her capability or were so aggressively supportive of it that the support itself became a kind of condescension. Warren Sullivan simply accepted it as a given and built his working relationship with her on that foundation, which was the only kind of relationship she had any patience for anymore. Thomas would have liked you, she said, and was slightly surprised to hear herself say it. Warren was quiet for a moment. What was he like? He was generous to a fault. He would have given the ranch away if someone had asked convincingly enough, which is why I handled the accounts. She smiled slightly, and it was a real smile, the kind with memory in it. He was good with the horses in a way I never was. He could read cattle better than anyone I knew. He just could not read numbers. She paused. He trusted me completely. I think that was his greatest gift to me. Not the land, not the partnership, the trust. Warren looked at her with that quality of attention she had come to recognize in him, deep and quiet and entirely present. He sounds like a man worth missing, he said. He was, she said simply. The lamp flickered between them in a small current of night air, and neither of them spoke for a moment, and the silence was not uncomfortable in the way that silences between near strangers usually are. It was the silence of 2 people who were beginning to understand each other's gravity. The morning of the land office confrontation arrived gray and cold, with a wind that came rattling across the Kansas plain with nothing to stop it for 200 miles. Margaret dressed carefully, not to impress anyone, but because how you presented yourself in a legal confrontation was itself a form of argument. She wore her best walking dress, dark green wool with practical buttons, her hair pinned with precision, her bearing deliberately composed. She met Warren at the land office before Holt and Vane arrived. They reviewed the plan one final time. Warren would handle the legal argument. Margaret would have her documents in order and available. If Morrow attempted to interfere, she would produce the letter from the Secretary of State's office preemptively. If Judge Fell appeared unexpectedly, they had already prepared a written summary of the evidence that Warren would request be entered into the public record before any proceedings began. "Are you ready?" Warren asked. She looked at him steadily. "I have been ready for 14 months. Something moved in his expression. He held her gaze for a beat longer than was strictly necessary. Then he nodded and they went in. Holt and Vane arrived 20 minutes later with all the theatrical confidence of people who believed this was a formality. Holt slapped the deed on the table. Margaret did not flinch. Cecilia Vane stood beside him with her ostrich feather and her rehearsed expression of wounded entitlement. And then Warren Sullivan walked to the table, picked up the deed, and read it with the precise attention of a man who knew exactly what he was looking for. And then he tore it in half. What happened in the next 10 minutes was not loud but was absolutely definitive. Warren placed the two halves of the deed on the table and laid out the argument with a clarity that was almost mathematical. The notarial seal discrepancy, the letter from the Secretary of State, the dates, the timeline, the impossibility of the stamp's existence on the document's claimed execution date. Elias Morrow did not say much, because Warren had already anticipated every objection Morrow might raise and addressed it before it was spoken, which was a particular skill that left opponents with the unpleasant feeling of having been read thoroughly before the conversation began. Dorian Holt's confidence eroded in real time, which was unpleasant to watch but necessary. He shifted from aggressive certainty to technicality seeking to a kind of pinched, calculating reassessment of what could be salvaged from the situation. Cecilia Vane's expression moved through several phases. The first was shock. The second was a rapid reassessment of her circumstances. The third was something more complicated. A look she directed at Dorian Holt that contained a very significant quantity of anger that had been waiting behind a very thin dam. "You told me this was airtight," she said to him, quietly, in a voice that carried the edge of someone who had been used as an instrument in someone else's scheme and was beginning to calculate the consequences. Holt did not answer her. Margaret watched this and filed it away. When the immediate confrontation was concluded, when Morrow had stamped the fraudulent deed as invalid and entered Warren's documentation into the formal county record, and it was thoroughly clear to everyone present that there was no pathway forward for the claim, Dorian Holt picked up his briefcase and walked out with the rigid spine of a man sustaining dignity through willpower alone. Cecilia Vane did not follow him immediately. She stood for a moment in the middle of the land office and her expression had changed entirely. The performance was gone. What was underneath it was tired and young and frightened, and it made her look different, more real, and therefore more sympathetic than Margaret had expected to find her. "Mrs. Hart," Cecilia said. Margaret waited. "I want you to know that I did not know the deed was forged." Her voice was steady but effortful. "Holt told me it was legitimate. He told me my husband had genuinely purchased the property. He showed me documents that I believed them." Margaret studied her. She had spent enough years reading people in negotiation to know the difference between genuine distress and performed distress, and this looked genuine. "How did Holt come to you?" she asked. "He approached me in Wichita 3 months after Aldous died. He said he had evidence of a property I was entitled to and that he would handle everything for a percentage of the land value." Cecilia's jaw tightened. "I was desperate. I had nothing. Aldous left debts, not assets, and I had nowhere to go and nothing to live on. When someone puts a legitimate-looking document in front of you and tells you it is your salvation, you want to believe it." Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Who is Holt working for?" Cecilia's eyes shifted briefly to Warren Sullivan, then back. "He mentioned a commissioner, Halliday. He met with him twice before we came to Caldwell." Margaret looked at Warren. He was already writing in his small leather-bound book. "Cecilia," Margaret said, with a deliberateness that signaled something important was following, "if you are willing to provide a formal statement about your dealings with Holt and the mention of Commissioner Halliday, I can connect you with the district attorney's office. As a victim of fraud rather than a perpetrator, your situation is considerably more manageable than Holt's." Cecilia Vane looked at her with an expression that was equal parts surprise and relief. "Why would you help me?" "Because you did not forge the deed," Margaret said simply. "Holt did or had it done, and Halliday funded it or arranged it. Those are the people who need to answer for this. You are just someone who got caught in their scheme." Warren Sullivan, from across the room, looked at Margaret Hart with an expression that she felt rather than saw, because she was looking at Cecilia when he looked at her. But she felt it, that particular quality of attention that had been building for 2 days, now deepened by something new. The weeks following the confrontation unfolded in a way that kept both Margaret and Warren occupied in close proximity for longer than either had anticipated, which was not a hardship for either of them, though neither said so. The case against Dorian Holt moved forward quickly once Cecilia Vane provided her statement. The district attorney, a methodical man named Claude Reyes who was genuinely interested in the integrity of his county's legal system, began an investigation that rapidly expanded to include Commissioner Halliday's financial records and his communications with Elias Morrow at the county clerk's office. Warren was involved as a formal consultant to the investigation. Margaret was involved as the primary complainant and witness. They met at her ranch, at Warren's office in town, at the district attorney's office, and at various points in between. They reviewed documents together. They discussed legal strategy. They had coffee and occasionally meals that started as working meals and gradually became, over the course of several weeks, meals that had less and less to do with work. Margaret noticed the transition but did not name it, because naming things prematurely had always struck her as dangerous. The investigation revealed what Margaret had suspected. Commissioner Brent Halliday had been engineering a systematic effort to acquire or control several properties in the eastern part of Caldwell County, using a combination of forged instruments, judicial influence through Judge Fell, and Morrow's position in the clerk's office to file fraudulent documents and suppress challenges. Blackwood Ranch was the most valuable target, but it was not the only one. 2 other families had recently lost property disputes under similarly suspicious circumstances. When the full scope of the scheme became clear, the district attorney brought charges against Halliday, Holt, Morrow, and Judge Fell. The charges were serious, and the evidence was substantial. All 4 men were removed from their positions pending trial, and the 2 families who had lost property in what appeared to be fraudulent proceedings were granted stays and reviews of their cases. Margaret testified clearly and without drama. She presented her documentation with the same systematic precision she brought to everything, and the district attorney later told Warren that she was the most organized witness he had ever worked with. Warren passed this along to her at dinner one evening in early spring, and she smiled in a way that made the lamplight seem warmer. "He should see my cattle ledgers," she said. Warren looked at her over his coffee cup with an expression that she had catalogued carefully over the preceding weeks and could now identify with some confidence as something more than professional regard. She held his gaze and waited, because she was a woman of patience when patience was the right instrument. "Margaret," he said, using her first name, which he had begun doing about 2 weeks prior in a way that had been gradual enough that neither of them had made it into a moment, "I want to say something, and I want to say it clearly so there is no ambiguity." "I appreciate clarity," she said. "I know you do." The slight pause before a significant statement which she had catalogued. "Over the last several weeks working with you, I have come to regard you with it is more than professional respect, considerably more." He turned his coffee cup in his hands in a slow rotation. "You are the most capable person I have worked with in 10 years of this work, and you are, I find that I think about you when I am not working with you, which has not been my experience with colleagues." Margaret set down her fork. "How long have you been composing that statement?" The corner of his mouth moved. "Since approximately the morning I watched you drive fence posts in a canvas coat, and then produce documentation that predicted my legal strategy before I had articulated it. She laughed, which was a sound that surprised her slightly with its ease. That was the first day. Yes, she looked at him steadily. I want to say something clearly as well, please. I am not interested in a conventional arrangement, she said. I have run this ranch alone for 14 months. I'm not going to hand over the management of it or the decision-making about it to anyone, regardless of the personal nature of the relationship. I will work with a partner. I will not work for a husband. I would not have it any other way, Warren said, without hesitation, and the absence of hesitation was more convincing than any elaboration would have been. You are sure about that? I am a man who has spent years working in a profession that requires accurate assessment of situations, he said. I have accurately assessed this one. You would be a terrible ranch wife in the conventional sense and an extraordinary partner in the actual sense. I am interested in the actual sense. Margaret picked up her fork again. Then we have a basis for a conversation. I was hoping we did. The quiet between them after that was warm rather than merely comfortable, which was different, and they both knew it. Spring came to Caldwell County with the particular violence of Kansas Spring's wind, and then sudden warmth, and then thunderstorms that rolled in from the southwest and lit the whole sky up. Margaret loved Kansas Springs with the fierce, complicated love of someone who had lived through enough of them to know their character. She and Warren moved from dinner conversations to evening rides across the property in the long spring light. These rides were not sentimental. They were practical, in the way that everything between them was at least partly practical, because they were both people for whom the practical and the emotional were not opposites but companions. Warren would ask about the herd or the fencing or the water situation on the south pasture, and she would tell him, and the conversation would shift from land management to something more personal and then back again, like water moving around rocks. One evening in late April, they rode out to the eastern boundary of the property, where Margaret had placed her original survey markers in 1878. The markers were still their iron stakes driven deep with a precision that had outlasted 4 years of Kansas weather. She dismounted and walked to the nearest one, crouching down to check it, running her gloved fingers along the stamped number on the cap. Warren dismounted behind her and came to stand nearby. These markers are what saved the property, he said. Without your survey documentation, even the notarial seal argument might not have been sufficient on its own to defeat a coordinated effort with judicial backing. Margaret stood up. The evening light was orange and very clear, the kind of light that made distances look different. I put them in because I wanted the land to be certain, she said. Thomas used to say I was too precise about the boundary lines, that it was enough to know roughly where one property ended and another began. But rough is not enough when someone wants what you have. No, Warren agreed. It is not. She turned to look at him. He was facing west, the light full on his face, and she thought not for the first time that he was a remarkably good-looking man in the way that the land itself was good-looking. Not ornamental, not arranged for effect, but solid and honest and built by long experience into something real. You mentioned a difficult period, she said, when you described why you came to Kansas. He looked at her. In the evening quiet with the grass moving around them, the shift in his expression was very clear. You noticed that I did not elaborate. I notice most things, she said without apology. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I was married once, in Colorado. Her name was Clara. She died in childbirth in 1877. The child did not survive either. Margaret felt the weight of that land in the air between them and did not try to move it. I spent a year after that I prefer not to describe in detail, he said. Then I came to Kansas and threw myself into work because work is a reliable thing when most other things are not. I understand that, she said quietly. I know you do. He looked at her with a directness that he reserved for things he meant completely. You are the first person since Clara who has made me think about the future instead of the work. She held his gaze. The orange light was fading to rose at the edges. In the distance, a meadowlark was making its last announcement of the day. "I think about the future," she said, and the admission was quiet but deliberate. "I think about it differently than I did 14 months ago, or even 4 months ago." He reached out and took her gloved hand in his, not with urgency but with the careful deliberateness of a man who had thought about doing exactly this for some time and was making sure he was doing it right. She let him. They stood at the iron survey marker on the eastern boundary of Blackwood Ranch as the Kansas sky moved through its evening colors above them. And the moment was not dramatic, but it was entirely real, which was, Margaret Hart had long since decided, the only kind of moment worth having. The trial of Dorian Holt, Commissioner Halliday, Elias Morrow, and Judge Armenfell took place in June of 1882, in a courtroom in Caldwell that was standing room only for most of the proceedings. The people of Caldwell County had opinions about corrupt judges and commissioners, and they expressed those opinions through attendance and the particular quality of silence that crowds use to indicate collective judgment. Margaret testified on the second day. She was composed and precise and utterly unflappable, which she knew frustrated Holt's defense attorney, a man named Forbes who specialized in flustering witnesses through aggressive questioning. Forbes was not able to fluster Margaret Hart because she knew her documentation better than he did, and because she had the particular quality of a person who has survived genuine threats and finds courtroom theatrics comparatively unimpressive. At one point, Forbes suggested that her surveying records might have been prepared after the fact, that she could have backdated them to support her claim. Margaret looked at him with an expression of polite but absolute patience and said, "Mr. Forbes, the surveying records I produced are written in weathered ink on paper that shows 4 years of handling. The reference measurements in those records correspond precisely with physical markers that were examined last April by 2 independent surveyors appointed by the district attorney's office. The markers show weathering and settlement consistent with 4 to 5 years in the ground. The correlation between my written records and the physical evidence is exact to within 1/4 inch. If I backdated these records, I did so with a time machine." The courtroom made a sound. Warren, sitting behind the bar, made a sound that he very quickly converted to a cough. Forbes moved on. All 4 defendants were convicted. Halliday received the most severe sentence, 7 years in the state penitentiary for fraud, conspiracy, and abuse of official position. Holt received 5 years. Morrow received 2 years and a lifetime ban from public office. Judge Fell, whose offense was the most significant in terms of institutional damage, received 8 years and the permanent loss of his license. The 2 families whose properties had been wrongfully affected had their cases reviewed and their property returned. The county appointed a new judge and a new commissioner and a new clerk, and there was a general sense of the air having been cleared. Margaret walked out of the courthouse on the final day of verdicts into the June sunshine and stood on the steps and breathed. Warren came out behind her and stood beside her. "It is finished," he said. "Yes," she said. He looked out across the main street of Caldwell, where the ordinary traffic of a frontier town went about its ordinary business in the warm afternoon. Then he looked at her. "Will you have dinner with me tonight? Not a working dinner." She looked at him with a smile that had been building for 3 months and had finally arrived at its full expression. "I thought you would never get around to asking." "I have been asking," he said, with the patience of a man who knows exactly what he has done and when. "I have been asking in every possible way except explicitly." "I noticed," she said. "I wanted the explicit version." He offered his arm, which she took, and they walked down the courthouse steps together into the June afternoon with the particular ease of 2 people who have decided without drama that they are going in the same direction. They were married in August. The wedding was small and practical in keeping with both their personalities, though Pearl Dawes had managed to install considerably more flowers than either Margaret or Warren had specifically requested, and the effect was pleasant enough that neither of them objected. It was held on the ranch, because it was their place, Margaret's place, and, increasingly, Warren's, and because the land itself felt like the appropriate witness to the commitment. Cecilia Vane, who had cooperated fully with the prosecution and had been cleared of any fraud charges, and had subsequently taken a position in Wichita as a bookkeeper for a dry goods merchant, sent a letter and a very good quality set of surveying tools as a gift, which Margaret considered the most thoughtful wedding present she received. Warren had integrated himself into the life of Blackwood Ranch with a naturalness that surprised some of their neighbors and surprised neither Margaret nor Warren, because they had both seen it coming from approximately the second day of working together. He was not a rancher by training, but he was deeply practical and willing to learn, and he had a way with horses that Margaret respected even though it was different from her own approach. He handled the survey work and the legal consulting from the ranch, riding into Caldwell when needed, but spending most of his days on the property. Margaret kept the accounts. Warren helped with the quarterly reports because he had a head for numbers and enjoyed the work. They disagreed occasionally about operational decisions. Warren had ideas about expanding the cattle operation that Margaret thought were premature given the current market conditions. Margaret had ideas about water infrastructure on the South Pasture that Warren thought were expensive even if they were strategically sound. And they argued these disagreements with the precision and good faith of two people who trusted each other's reasoning even when they were not persuaded by it. The arguments were, Margaret reflected, some of her favorite conversations. They were also, for the first time in her adult life, conversations she did not have alone in her head and then implement unilaterally. Having Warren meant having a person whose judgment she trusted and whose perspective genuinely surprised her sometimes, which was not something she had expected to find, having been largely self-sufficient for so long. In the evenings, in the autumn after the wedding, they would sit on the porch of the ranch house in the cooling air and watch the Kansas sky do its enormous things, and she would sometimes find herself simply grateful in a way that she had learned in the harder years, was not guaranteed, and should not be taken for granted. Their son was born in the summer of 1883, on a July morning when the whole county was between a heat wave and a thunderstorm that rolled in from the northwest and arrived just as labor did, with characteristic Kansas timing. They named him James Thomas Sullivan, the Thomas for Margaret's late husband and the James for Warren's father, and the combination seemed right to both of them, a name that held the past and moved forward with it. Warren had been more frightened during the birth than he had been during any property dispute or legal confrontation of his professional life, which he admitted to Margaret while she was resting afterward with James Thomas asleep on her chest, and which made her laugh weakly but genuinely. "You were perfectly calm," he said. "I was not calm," she replied. "I simply did not have the option of expressing it. That is a different kind of courage than the kind I know how to use." She looked at him over the baby's dark, damp head. "Different, not greater." "Equal then," he said, and sat down beside her and put his arm around her with the careful gentleness of a man who was holding something he knew the value of. James Thomas was a vigorous child who showed an early and determined interest in everything that moved horses, cattle, the mathematical instruments his mother kept in her study, the legal texts his father kept in his. By the time he was walking confidently, he would find the surveying compass and carry it from room to room with the gravity of a very small person who had found an object of great significance. Margaret watched this from across the room one afternoon and felt something warm and specific move through her. Warren, who had come in from outside and was watching over her shoulder, said quietly, "He takes after you. He is interested in everything," she said. "He takes after both of us." In 1885, a second child arrived, a daughter they named Clara Me, the Clara for Warren's first wife and the Me for Margaret's mother, and the name was a small, careful acknowledgement of everything that had been lost and everything that had been found. Clara Me was quieter than James Thomas and had Warren's gray eyes and her mother's precision of attention, and she would grow up to have her mother's instinct for numbers and her father's instinct for people. The ranch expanded. Margaret's water infrastructure project on the South Pasture, eventually implemented after a careful assessment of a favorable cattle market, proved as strategically sound as she had argued. Warren's proposal to increase the herd, implemented 2 years after Margaret had initially deemed it premature, when the market conditions had in fact developed as she had projected, increased their operating revenues substantially. Pearl Dawes noted approvingly to anyone who asked, and several people who did not, that Blackwood Ranch under Margaret and Warren Sullivan was the best-run operation in the eastern part of Caldwell County, and that this was primarily because neither of them was foolish enough to let pride get in the way of good judgment. There was one afternoon in the autumn of 1885 that Margaret returned to in her memory with a frequency that surprised her. She had been out on the North Pasture, checking the cattle, riding alone on her gray mare in the late October light. Warren was in town at a legal consultation. The children were with Pearl, who had become something between a close friend and an informal aunt to James Thomas and infant Clara Mee. The air was the particular gold of late autumn, and the grass had gone tawny, and the sky was enormous and entirely clear. She had stopped on the ridge of the North Pasture, the highest point on the property, where on clear days you could see 20 miles in every direction, and she had looked at all of it, the land running to the horizon in every direction, the ranch buildings below, the cattle in the far pasture, the line of the creek glittering in the afternoon light. She thought about the morning 14 months after Thomas's death when she had stood in this same place at 4:30 in the morning trying to calculate whether she could keep this land. She thought about the parchment hitting the table. She thought about the sound of a deed being torn in half. She thought about an evening in late April with the orange light fading and a hand taking hers at an iron survey marker. She thought about Warren, who at that moment was probably in a county office somewhere making a precise, careful argument on behalf of a client, pressing his thumb against the side of his index finger when he concentrated, thanking someone specifically for their coffee. She thought about James Thomas carrying the surveying compass around the house with his serious small face. She thought about Clara Mee, who was 3 months old and had a way of looking at you when you spoke to her that suggested she was recording everything for later reference. The October light moved on the grass below her, and a flock of birds crossed the sky to the south, and Caldwell County went about its business in every direction around her. And Margaret Hart, Margaret Sullivan now, though she kept Hart in professional and legal contexts because it was her name and she had earned it, felt the full weight of her life settle into something that was not contentment exactly, because contentment suggested stillness, and she was not a still person, but something more like rightness, the sense that the thing was what it was supposed to be. The Blackwood Ranch legal case became a reference point in Caldwell County legal history, cited periodically in subsequent property disputes as an example of how meticulous documentation could defeat coordinated fraud. Warren wrote it up as a formal legal analysis in 1884 and submitted it to the Kansas Law Review, where it was published under both their names, Warren Sullivan and Margaret Hart Sullivan, because the analysis would not have been possible without her evidence, and he told the editor as much. Margaret framed the published page and put it in her study, next to the letter from the Kansas Secretary of State's office that had identified the notarial seal dates. She also kept the 2 halves of the forged deed, which Warren had saved from the land office floor. She had them mounted behind glass in a simple frame that hung in the hallway of the ranch house, where visitors sometimes asked about them. Her answer was always the same. That is a reminder that the land knows who belongs to it. Warren, if he was nearby when she said this, would add, without looking up from whatever he was doing, and that forgers rarely have perfect information. James Thomas grew up hearing this exchange with the regularity of a family proverb, and he would later tell his own children that he had learned 2 things from his parents above all others: the importance of documentation and the value of knowing who is worth trusting. By the autumn of 1887, Blackwood Ranch was one of the more prosperous properties in Caldwell County, with a herd that had grown to 200 head and a reputation for well-managed land that attracted respectful acknowledgement from neighboring ranchers. Warren had expanded his legal consulting work to include 3 other counties, riding circuits several days a month, and returning with the reliable pleasure of a man who enjoyed his work, but enjoyed coming home more. James Thomas was 4 years old, and Clara Mee was 2, and they had between them enough energy and curiosity to keep both parents continuously engaged with the world. On a September morning, when the first chill of the coming autumn was in the air, and the cottonwoods along the creek were beginning to turn, Margaret and Warren rode out together before breakfast across the north pasture in the early light. These morning rides had become a fixture of their life together, an unscheduled space between the demands of the day, where the conversation ranged from practical to philosophical to personal, without particular structure. She was telling him about a boundary survey she was planning on the southwest corner of the property, where a new family named the Garretts had settled, and where she wanted to document the markers preemptively rather than reactively, when Warren turned and looked at her with an expression she recognized, the pause before something significant. "What?" she said. "I'm going to say something that I want you to hear without the professional frame," he said. She turned her horse to face him. "All right. 5 years ago I did not think I would have this," he said, "any of it. The work has been good and it is meaningful work, but I mean the rest, the children, the land, you." He looked at her with the directness that she had come to know as his deepest register. "You are the most extraordinary person I have ever known, Margaret, and I do not mean in a specific category, I mean as a person, the whole of you." She held his gaze in the early morning light, with the cottonwoods glowing gold in the distance and the horses standing quietly and the sky enormous and blue above them. "Warren," she said, "yes, I love you too. In case the last 5 years have not made that sufficiently clear." The corner of his mouth lifted in the way she had memorized. "They have. I wanted to say mine explicitly. You told me you preferred the explicit version." She laughed, and it was the best kind of laugh, the kind that comes from real joy, from the specific and unrepeatable joy of being known and knowing someone else, and finding that the knowing makes the world larger rather than smaller. She reached across the space between their horses and took his hand, and they rode on across the north pasture into the September morning, with the ranch behind them and the day ahead and the land running to the horizon in every direction, certain and documented and entirely theirs. By the spring of 1888, Margaret was expecting their 3rd child. She told Warren on a Tuesday morning in April while they were both in the study reviewing cattle records, because that was who they were. The news came out in the middle of real life and belonged there. Warren put down his pencil and looked at her with an expression that crossed through surprise and landed in a deep, uncomplicated happiness that she found, as always, entirely genuine. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Practical," she said, "and somewhat pleased. That seems about right." He came around the table and took her face in his hands with his characteristic carefulness and kissed her forehead, then her mouth, and held her for a moment in the morning quiet of the study, with the survey records spread on the table and the sound of James Thomas somewhere in the house, explaining something loudly to Clara Mee in the earnest educational tone of an older sibling. "3," he said. "3," she agreed. "Assuming no further surprises from Caldwell County land law, I believe we have the operational capacity." He laughed. She felt it against her hair. Their 3rd child arrived in November of 1888, another son, whom they named Oliver Warren Sullivan, the Oliver chosen because Margaret had loved the name since childhood and the Warren because she wanted it in the family record in that particular place. Oliver was blond where his siblings were dark, and he had Margaret's green eyes, and he arrived into the family with the smooth confidence of a 3rd child who had been anticipated and prepared for, and was entirely welcome. James Thomas regarded his new brother with the solemn assessment of a 5-year-old who had opinions about everything. Clara Mee patted Oliver's head with an expression of proprietary satisfaction. Oliver looked at both of them with his mother's calm attention and appeared to be gathering information. The winter of 1888 and 1889 was a long one, even by Kansas standards cold, that settled in early November and did not ease until late March. Margaret managed the cattle operations through it with the systematic preparation she applied to everything, and the herd came through the winter without significant loss. Warren rode the frozen roads to his consulting appointments and came home to the warmth of the ranch house with the particular gratitude of a man who knew what he was coming home to. In the evenings, with 3 children asleep down the hallway, they would sit by the parlor stove with the lamps burning low and talk about the future in the relaxed, ranging way that is only possible when the present is secure. About where James Thomas would go for his schooling when he was older. About Clara Mee, who was showing the kind of mathematical aptitude that her mother found both predictable and deeply satisfying. About Oliver, who was too young for predictions, but who already showed a calm observational quality that Warren said reminded him of no one so much as Margaret herself. About the ranch, the South Pasture development, the water management, the possibility in a few years of purchasing the adjacent property that old Garrett was rumored to be thinking about selling. About the law Warren's work, the ongoing development of property rights in the expanding territory, the cases that came to him with the particular complexity that kept the work interesting. About how the legal landscape of the frontier was changing as the territory became more settled, more structured, and whether that was simply progress or something more complicated. About the past carefully, with the respect that both of them had for things that had been hard. Clara, whom Warren spoke about now with the quiet memorial love of someone who has made peace with loss without diminishing it. Thomas, whom Margaret remembered with the warm and specifically located love of someone who was the first chapter in a story that had more chapters. About the first day, the corrals and the canvas coat and the post driver and the surveying records. "You were not at all what I expected," Warren said on one of these evenings, not for the first time. "What did you expect? A frightened widow in need of legal assistance. And what did you find? A woman with a post driver and a letter from the Secretary of State that she had written before she knew what the forgery looked like." Margaret smiled into her coffee. "I was frightened. I was simply too busy preparing to show it." "That is the bravest kind of frightened," he said. She looked across the lamplight at him, at the face she had memorized in 5 years of weather and work and mornings and arguments and laughter and grief and joy. The face that was, she thought, the most reliable thing in her world after the iron markers on the eastern boundary. "We did well," she said. It was not an elaborate statement, and she did not mean it to be. She meant the case and the ranch and the children asleep down the hall and the long cold winter that the cattle had come through intact and the spring that was coming. She meant the whole of it. "We did," he said, with the simplicity that was his greatest quality. The stove ticked in the quiet. Outside, the Kansas night was very cold and very clear. In the morning, Margaret would ride the north pasture, check the cattle, look at the survey markers on the eastern boundary, and find them exactly where she had put them. Warren would ride to town for a consultation and come home in the afternoon with the news that the Garrett property was in fact for sale and that the asking price was reasonable. There would be decisions to make and accounts to review and children to manage and land to tend and arguments to have and agreements to reach and evening rides in the long spring light. And all of it would unfold with the productive, purposeful forward motion of 2 people who had chosen each other not because the world was simple, but because it was not. And because having someone beside you who could read the terrain and think clearly under pressure and love you, without requiring you to be smaller than you were, was the rarest and most valuable thing the frontier or anywhere else had to offer. Blackwood Ranch stood on the Kansas plain in the winter dark. its boundary markers precisely set and its records meticulously kept, and its land entirely its own. And inside, in the lamplight, Margaret Hart Sullivan and Warren Sullivan sat beside the stove in the comfortable quiet of two people who had built something real together, and the fire burned steadily, and the future stretched ahead of them like well-surveyed land, certain, documented, and full of everything that was still to come.